Hello everybody, and welcome to Theology 101. Today we are continuing our verses series, comparing the views of Calvinism and Arminianism. Last time we compared total depravity versus free will. Today we will be comparing the second theological points in each system, unconditional and conditional election. Election refers to the belief that God chooses individuals to be saved. Calvinism and Arminianism agree that God chooses people to be saved, but they disagree on the reason why God chooses people to be saved. For Calvinism, God elected people based on his sovereign will. God's election is unconditional since God chooses people regardless of how they will respond. This concept is called predestination. For Arminianism, God elects people based on his foreknowledge. Since God knows the future, he knows whether people will choose him or reject him. Keep in mind, Arminianism believes that people have libertarian free will because of prevenient grace. People can choose or reject God. Therefore, Arminianism calls it conditional election. Since God elects people conditioned on his foreknowledge on whether people will choose him or reject him in the future. Now let the debate begin. We see unconditional election throughout the Bible. When God chose Israel, he did not choose them as his nation based on anything they did. He did not choose them as his nation because they were greater than other nations or morally superior to them. He chose them because of the promise he made to Abraham. In the New Testament, we see that God also elects unconditionally Christians onto salvation. Paul writes, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. For those who are called according to his purpose, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified." In Paul's mind, everything happens according to God's predetermined plan. Paul argues unconditional election so clearly that he anticipates people's objections to it and responds this way. "But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, 'Why have you made me like this?'" Unconditional election may be hard to swallow, but Paul makes it clear that this is how God elects, even if we might not agree with it. You quote Romans 8:28 as support for your view, but it actually supports conditional election. Paul starts the chain of events for election this way. Those whom he foreknew. God's election is based on his foreknowledge. The Apostle Peter says the same thing when he addresses Christians by identifying them as those chosen according to the foreknowledge of God. God's foreknowledge is the foundation for his election. Also, your understanding of election emphasizes the individual without considering the corporate aspects to election. What I mean is that God's election is not to specific individuals, but to a community who is identified with Christ. God's election is offered freely to everybody, and whoever responds by faith become part of the elect community since they are now in Christ. Jesus describes the kingdom of heaven to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. The nation that the king rules over in the parable represents Israel. The servants he sends to invite his people to the wedding feast represents the apostles and prophets. Then those who received the king's invitation represents how the gospel went first to the nation of Israel, then to the Gentiles. Finally, only those wearing the wedding clothes, which represent those who are identified by Christ's righteousness by faith. The moral of the parable, according to Jesus, was that many are called, but few are chosen or elected. Many are unconditionally invited to the kingdom, but only those who are elected were conditionally chosen based upon what they wore. This is a picture of corporate election. We are elected only insofar as we wear Christ and identify with him by faith. Paul seems to emphasize individual election. He describes that God chose specific kinds of people to be in the church. He did not choose the church and leave its composition to our choice, but he also chose the individuals and called them to Christ. He chose the foolish, the weak, the low, and despised, and call them into Christ. Then Paul makes it clear that it is by God's doing that these individuals are put in Christ, and it is not based on those individuals' response. Also, Romans chapter 9 gives the clearest picture of unconditional election of individuals. Paul sets out to prove that God's salvation was never conditioned upon birth, family lineage, or personal merit. Salvation has always been on the basis of divine individual election. Paul supports his argument with examples of how God, acts this way in the Old Testament. God chose Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, and Moses over Pharaoh. All three examples reveal that God chose certain individuals onto salvation not based on their merits, but based on his mercy. I have a very different interpretation of Romans 9. Again, you read it as individual election when it should be read as corporate election. God unconditionally chose a nation, namely Israel, but not the specific individuals of this nation. It is true that Paul lists out certain individuals, but those individuals represent the nation of Israel. God chose Isaac because the covenant promise to Israel was to continue through the lineage of Isaac instead of Ishmael's. God chose Jacob and Moses because they were the representative leaders of Israel during their time. Paul's point is not that God elects certain individuals unconditionally. It is that God unconditionally elects the nation, and whoever responded by faith to Yahweh, even if he or she was not physically an Israelite, were now part of the elect nation. God's prevenient grace enables us to make the choice to believe and respond to God. But we also have the choice to resist God's call to salvation. The choice to be elected is ultimately based on the individual's response, because we are morally responsible for choosing or rejecting God. Therefore, we cannot object to God's election or consider it unfair, because each person is elected based on whether he or she wants God or not. The fact that Paul felt that it was necessary to address people's objections that God's election was not fair means that people assumed that God elected people unconditionally. If God elected people conditioned on their choice, then why would anybody object to God being unfair? It seems that Romans chapter 9 only makes sense if God's people are elected unconditionally. So what do you guys think? Which view did you find more convincing? We will continue to address the other points of Calvinism and Arminianism in future videos, so make sure to subscribe to not miss it. If you found this video helpful, please like it and share it with a friend. And until next time, see you.